Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Xiao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Aloha.
Hey, hey.
Hi, hi, hi. Today we are continuing our discussion of The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin, the last book in our series, Contemporary Utopias. If this is your first time joining us, we are also a literary book club on Reddit. You can join our discussion there by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can support us and your local bookstore by using our bookshop.org link, which is in our episode description as well. We're also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will conclude the series on contemporary utopias with a wrap up of all three books that we read for this series: Paradise by Toni Morrison, Kirinyaga by Mike Resnick, and The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well.
This novel, I think, is quite clearly focused on anarchism as a kind of organizing principle for societies. And I think that Le Guin has some very specific points that she wants to make about a very specific type of anarchism. And I'm just wondering what your general thoughts are. What do you think she has to say in general about anarchism?
It's good. She's for it.
I think she's for it, but it seems like she wants to point out that no system is perfect, that every system has flaws.
So then, if that's what she's saying, does that mean that the flaws that she points out in the novel aren't damning flaws? They don't spoil anarchism for her?
I don't think it spoils anarchism for her, but I think they're real issues. I don't think these are issues that can be swept under the rug. I get the sense that at the end, I think we talked about this a little bit last time, that Shevek is returning to Anaris partly for his system because he's used to it and he's familiar with it, and because for him it works, at least to some degree. But he's also returning to just familiarity and his family. I don't know how much he loves the system.
I think that you're right. Here, I think it might be worthwhile to be a little bit more specific because if you spend time talking to anarchists, you'll eventually find out that they are very willing to divide and subdivide their way of thinking. And there are so many different kinds of anarchism. And if you end up disagreeing with them, what will probably happen is they'll say, oh, well, you're disagreeing with a different form of anarchism. And my form of anarchism is the one that was created to avoid that problem. So in this novel, I think what she is presenting is a form of anarchism called anarcho-syndicalism. And as I understand it, that form believes in self-management of workers and direct action. So that means that workers will arrange their own work and people will represent themselves politically rather than indirectly representing themselves through a representative in a democracy. And when people are working together, they can enter and exit these collaborative units that they call syndicates as they wish. So, that to me, I think, is the kind of anarchism involved in this novel. But I think the second idea is an idea that comes from a Russian anarchist called Peter Kropotkin. We talked about Kropotkin a little bit when we were reading the Lime Works by Thomas Bernhard as well. And this comes up in the novel when we talk about their religious belief, or I don't know if it's a religious belief, but their ideology of Odinism, which I have read is very, very closely linked to Kropotkin's ideas about mutual aid. Kropotkin wrote a book called Mutual Aid, and the basic idea, as I understand it, is it's an argument against Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest. The idea is that all animals actually cooperate with each other naturally, and that the purpose of that cooperation isn't because they love each other, but because cooperation is mutually advantageous. So, with that in mind, do you think that these things really can work well together? Like, do you think you can have anarcho syndicalism and mutual aid at the same time?
Why wouldn't you?
Well, I think that the novel shows some examples of how they don't work together. What I think is interesting is that they seem to cancel each other out. Anarchism, in the novel, I think, allows people to manage their own work and act directly in their own interest. But the way that they understand mutual advantage is often as they see it through other people's eyes. So, for example, in the novel, Shevek's wife, or not his wife, but his partner, has to go to another place for her work. And he would prefer very much to go with her because he's attached to her, but he knows that other people will look at him in a certain way if he does what he wants to do. So he is compelled to do things that he doesn't want to do or things that are not necessarily in his own interest because he feels the judgment or he feels the potential scorn of other people if he follows this woman and does things there that are not optimally beneficial for his society. So it is a kind of coercion that is perhaps the same in effect as the coercion that we feel in a statist society.
There was a sense of paranoia that there was something about the system trying to keep them apart, even though they couldn't prove it. And it could have just been paranoia, but the idea that she was being sent so far away and that he was being sent to the opposite end of the planet. And eventually he made his way to her. But then, like you're saying, that comes with a certain stigma.
So, Kropotkin's Mutual Aid was written not just in response to Darwin, but to the capitalist society at the time, right? And so I think that his influence on anarchism is like vast. And anarcho syndicalism, I think, grows out of, all the anarchist movements that kind of grew out of Kropotkin. Like, Kropotkin is one of the most important anarchist thinkers. So it's hard for me to understand these two as opposites because I don't think they're opposites. I don't think anarcho syndicalists are in opposition to Kropotkin's mutual aid. In fact, I think they're very much in favor of most of what Kropotkin would advocate for. I think what we see dramatized in the novel is the critique of anarchism or of anarchy, which is that if an anarchist society is to function, you have to have some kind of mutuality and you have to have some kind of selflessness. But at the same time, everyone is self interested. I think that's what she's bringing to anarchism. She's saying that we are all self interested, even if we are raised in an anarcho syndicalist society, even with the language, even with the belief in the system. In the end, we still have self interest. There's something essentially human about that. And that's the conflict that she is introducing, which I think you can read as perhaps a critique of anarchism. Because how is society to work if people are inherently self interested in an anarchist society?
So when I say that they cancel each other out, I don't mean that people who believe in anarcho syndicalism would not believe in mutual aid, but rather that the practice of each cancels out the benefits of the other. Because the practice of syndicalism is that you can choose where to work and you work there of your own free will. But the practice of mutual aid means that you are trying to do things that are beneficial broadly to the entire society. And I think you're right that it is a conflict between the global interest and the self interest, or the society's interest and the self interest. But the invariable conflict and the problem with it is that we can't help but always think about how other people perceive us. And that's the reason why you don't really have this free will that you want from anarcho syndicalism, because we're always aware of how our work benefits or harms other people. I think we see this elsewhere in the novel when who is his mentor? Shevak's mentor, the obnoxious guy.
Sebel.
Yeah, when he's complaining about how Shevak's work is not practical and he's not able to keep his position at the institute because they feel that his work is not practical. Or the friend Kieran, who has a mental breakdown because he is creating subversive art. People are under this kind of psychic pressure to produce work that other people recognize as socially valuable.
I mean, this perhaps my bias because I'm actually quite sympathetic to anarcho-syndicalism. But I think the importance here is the fact that you can choose. The right to choose is the really important aspect of this belief. It's not that you are choosing to help society, it's that you have the right to choose.
Yeah, but there's still a stigma attached to, at least as she portrays it in the book, there's still people like Sabo who control things even if it's not supposed to be a controlled mechanism. He seems to have control over that syndicate. And if it's something that isn't seen as furthering what that person or whoever holds that power, for lack of a better term, if it doesn't appeal to what they see as beneficial to society or maybe even just the syndicate, then it gets quashed or at least put aside, discouraged.
The final example, though, I think is the most important one, is at the end of the novel where Shevek and Badap have their syndicate of initiative. I think that shows quite clearly how this idea of mutual advantage is very difficult to extend throughout a society in actual practice because they are very clearly interested in sending someone to Urus. And it's very clearly in their minds mutually advantageous to do so. But opposing them is Rulag, who is Shevek's mother. And in her mind, it's very clearly disadvantageous. Because of the way we have these different perspectives, there, it seems to me, will never be clarity as to what actual advantage is, because what is advantage, purely advantage to one person, is purely disadvantage to another.
Right. They can disagree, but this goes back to what we've talked about, I believe, on this book already, but also earlier in the series, that everyone has a different idea of what a utopia is, the same way as everyone might have a different idea of what works and serves a syndicate or a world like this and what doesn't. So, how do you square those things? How do you say, no, don't worry about it? This does serve society when another person says, no, it doesn't.
Well, this, for me, once again, I don't think it cancels out so much as it reveals something important in this kind of society, which is that there are always situations where two people disagree on what is more beneficial to society. But that doesn't mean that mutual aid doesn't work. It means that people have their own opinions on what is the most beneficial way forward. And sometimes you can't achieve mutual aid because you can't agree on what is mutually beneficial. For me, it doesn't obviate or cancel out the validity of this kind of system because you could say the same thing about any political system like capitalism. Like you could say, well, how does capitalism work? And pick out examples where it does not work. But it doesn't mean that capitalism doesn't exist or that it should or should not exist. For me, it's kind of the same argument where if you say, well, here's one example of a critique of a political system, it's the critique that we often have for more radical political ideologies, which is that here's a critique of an example when it doesn't work, therefore this whole thing doesn't work. But we don't hold the established systems to the same light. I mean, you guys are leftists as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, you know this. Like
Right.
Yeah.
when people who critique socialism always seem to behave as if capitalism doesn't have any issues.
This is something that we're going to talk about later on, but being on the left doesn't mean, at least to me, that you agree with everything on the left. Like, I disagree with anarchism as it's presented in this novel, and at least in my mind, not necessarily in Le Guin's mind, it's fundamentally flawed. But that doesn't mean that I also think that capitalism is perfect and flawless. I also agree that capitalism is fundamentally flawed. I don't think it's a choice between two options, but a choice between perhaps several options that have yet to be discovered.
I have a side note,
Yeah,
but we talked a lot about anarchism and we kind of glossed over this, but anarchism is not necessarily anti-capitalist because anarchism is anti-authority and anti-power,
right.
state power mostly. but she's presenting, a very socialist version of anarchism.
Yeah, that's true. It's not necessarily anti capitalist. In fact, I know a guy who is a very vocal anarcho capitalist.
I think we're in agreement here. I'm just saying that just because we have these examples, I don't think it means that this is not viable. It just means that she's presenting these examples, which is what you should do in a novel of ideas. Like, you should be presenting the idea and the weaknesses of the idea.
The reason why I think it's not viable is because you're saying that it's presenting this difficulty for two people to reach an agreement as to what is mutually advantageous. And that is fundamentally important. That is a necessary process of a human society, is for people to agree with each other. I think in my mind, anarchism, it's left very open because it wants to give people certain freedoms. It doesn't want to tell people what they must do. But if we don't tell people what they must do, I feel that it only really works in very primitive societies where I share something I have with you and you share something you have with me. But at the level of social complexity that we already have, and that I think most people would want to have, we need to reach many agreements every day, all the time. And because we need to do that, there are going to be so many gaps between what people think other people should do and what people actually want to do.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that anarchism is not well suited for a very complex world. But I would also say that capitalism is not especially suited for a very complex world either. But what capitalism does is, I mean, once again, you guys already know this, it achieves these shortcuts via force. That's the big difference. If you're an anarchist, you think that people should not be compelled through force, that people should be compelled via assent. Like, that's what anarchists believe. That's what sets them apart from non-anarchists. If you're an anarchist, mutually beneficial actions are just one way to resolve conflict. I mean, if you're an anarcho-syndicalist, I guess. But I think the big difference here is the use of force and assent. So, I don't know. I mean, is using force to compel other people as a way of cutting through all the red tape in the complex society, is that desirable? I mean, that's the question that, you ask as someone who is contemplating anarchism. You might say yes, like, it is desirable because you have to get things done. So the police has to come and clear you off the road or something, or give you a ticket if you parked for more than 3 hours.
Yeah, it's tough because, like you say, all you have are criticisms because there are examples of anarchist societies, but not on like a grand scale, not on a full country scale, for example. We have cells or we have smaller societies functioning as some form of anarchist, but we don't have, massive societies functioning that way because it just hasn't been done. Or when it's been tried, either forces from the inside or forces from the outside have caused them to stop.
I do think, though, that despite all of this, that Le Guin remains committed to anarchism despite these criticisms. It's not really about an argument for anarchism's virtue. It's much more that she increases our awareness of the flaws of anarchism's alternatives. It's kind of like in Buddhism, where you have Siddhartha escaping his father's palace and discovering all of the flaws of our world on Urus when Shevek leaves the university area where he's been kept and he goes into the streets with common people. He comes face to face with the extent of suffering on their planet. And then later on, when he talks to the ambassador from Terra, he learns about the ecological destruction of Terra. So I think that it's just the weight of the disadvantages of these other forms of social organization that are meant to overweigh the problems that she brings up with anarchist societies. And I think that that's the reason why he returns home at the end of the novel, because what Anaris can offer him is not freedom from hunger, because there are people who are starving on his home planet, but rather freedom from hunger while other people are eating. That to me brings up a very interesting question. At least for me, it's interesting. Is that enough? Like, does that difference mean anything to you? I think this is meant to be one of the ways that Le Guin is trying to persuade you in favor of Anaris and anarchism is that the suffering is equal. It's equally shared among all people. Does that matter?
I think he sees that the suffering is shared, but I think he also sees that it's a society that, while flawed, does try, at least to some extent, to find the best way forward for everyone rather than for a select few. And it's a system that he can work within to try to make better. Whereas Urus, I think he gives up on it because there doesn't seem to be a path forward, an equal path forward, without repeating several revolutions as they already have.
I think for me, that distinction does matter because you could say that one form of society where some people starve and others live in excess is more immoral than a society that is more equal in that everyone either starves together or lives in excess together.
I wanted to bring up his friend Tyrion. Even though Tyrion was never starving, he's still suffering. So, and it's a different kind of suffering. It's not starving. You could say it's, his soul or his mind or whatever is starving. So, how do you pair those things? How is that more just? It's just a different kind of suffering.
I don't think it's more just for me.
I don't even think we need to be less literal. I think we can continue talking about food. Like, isn't there a scene in the novel where Shevek is driving with that guy across the country and they have a bunch of food that they're supposed to give to people? And then along the way, they encounter other people who are starving. There will always be a situation when resources aren't enough that some people will end up eating where other people end up starving. If you supply all resources to everyone, somebody's going to get to them first, right? And does it matter if somebody gets to them first just because of pure luck or if somebody gets to them because of inequality in society? That to me, it seems also kind of silly.
I think it matters. You're asking if intention matters. I think intention does matter. I mean, if a society intends to make food distribution as equal as possible, that is more moral than the society that intends to make food distribution less equitable and creates a situation wherein some people starve and other people live in excess. I think one society is more moral than the other society, even if the end result isn't equal. I think the intention does matter.
I suppose so, but I think it's very theoretical because in either case, you have a scarcity of resources and you have some people who will get it and some people who won't. And in a capitalist or what they would call proprietarian system, the people who would get it are the people who own it or have paid for it. And on Anaris, the people who would get it are the people who just happen to be there at the right time. So it seems to me that there is an absence of thought on the point of Anaris, where it's just like they haven't really figured out a way to equitably share. And that absence of thought is preferable in a moral way to not sharing equally. But in a logistical way, it seems to be much less preferred because it seems to be just carelessness. Like they haven't really figured out what are we going to do when we don't have enough for everybody. Some system might be better than no system.
One of the things that the book theorizes that I find interesting is that Anaris is this desert moon, right? There's not a whole lot that can be grown or produced there. So anytime there is a drought, it's a huge catastrophe. Versus Urus, which is a lot like Earth is, where we have a lot of resources and there should be plenty. But just like on Earth, it doesn't get distributed equally. To me, it's interesting that the civilization like Anaris chooses not to monopolize everything. They choose to. I know this is cart before horse. It doesn't work like this. They went there after deciding what kind of system they would have. But still, on a desert world, they've still managed to create as equal a society as they can manage while having very little to distribute.
You might say, though, Sam, you might say that if you live in an environment where resources are scarce and you're a small group of people, you're more likely to have a mutually beneficial society. Whereas if you live in a society of excess where you have excess resources, you're much more likely to have a capitalist society.
Maybe, but doesn't it still come down to who the owners are? You can still create a society of owners who have all of the power and the wealth and the resources, even in a small society.
Places that have scarce resources tend to have fewer people, like, the Arctic.
Well, here's another way of looking at this. Why, in a place that has so many resources, what's to stop such a place from being equal?
I don't think I was being very clear. In a place that has very scarce resources, like the Arctic or the desert, people are compelled to be mutually beneficial because there are smaller groups of people. People tend to be in clans, so they know each other. In a place of wealth, where you can have huge populations, like over 1 million people, then society becomes much more complex and you don't know everyone. So it's much more likely for a person to behave selfishly and less mutually beneficial.
I think what we've kind of agreed on together is that the anarchism that we see in this novel would work well or could work well for a simple small society. But I think in our own worlds, we are more and more aware of how power and oppression are often linked to each other, and that there are many sources of power that go beyond just state power and capital. Does this novel address those other forms of power, or is it limited in some way?
Yeah, I think it does address some different forms of power. And one of the ones I saw is gender and how that comes into play, especially on Urus. I don't think it really is an issue on Anaris, but both sexes seem to think that they have particular forms of power on Urus.
What is the term that Shevek's partner comes up with for women who use their body to control men?
Yeah, it's something similar to like prostitution.
Yeah. There is a gender element to it. I think there are a few more examples. These examples I'm coming to come from an essay. It's called Postmodern Anarchism in the Novels of Ursula K. Le Guin. And the author points out several examples, but what he says at first is quite interesting. He says that traditional anarchism was born out of the concerns of the Industrial Revolution. It was born out of the 19th century. And at that time, people were very limited in their concerns, and they were more concerned with how their boss might oppress them or how their government might oppress them. But nowadays, we have moved on from what he would call modern concerns, and we demand postmodern anarchism. We demand a larger, more expansive type of anarchism to address these new ideas or these new forms of power that we've started to recognize. The first one that the author brings up is the invented language that they use. We talked about this last week. Their language is called Pravik that they use on Anaris. For example, in their language, when you talk about your own interests, you are egoizing. And they also don't use titles. So on Urus, Shevek is always being called Dr. Shevek, and he always says, no, 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 I'm not doctor. So they are aware of how language carries power in a very postmodern way. But do you think that this is a sincere extension of anarchism? Does it really matter? As a person living in our contemporary society with your awareness of these issues of power and oppression, would you want to live in a society that did not try to eliminate power in its language? Like, is having Pravik a good thing? Is it a plus?
I think it's an interesting thing. I don't know if I fully agree with its conclusions or with Le Guin's ideas. As we talked about last week, it's been more or less decided that thought comes before language. And I'm inclined to agree with that. I think it's an interesting exercise. I can see how it might help in certain cases. Like, I'm sure we've all met people who insist on being called doctor, and others who are doctors who don't give a shit, who would rather you just call them by their first name. So I think it still just comes down to a case by case basis, a person by person basis. I don't know that the language is going to change all that much. You're still going to have sables.
So, communist countries try to do this. Like in China, they renamed all the provinces, or almost all the provinces. And I think they did in Russia as well. I'm not as well versed in Russian history, USSR history. And the idea behind it is interesting. The idea that if you are beginning something new, then you have to strip away all the meanings that come with the old. I mean, I can understand that. You remove titles because Dr. Shevek doesn't only mean doctor, it means all the associations that come with doctor. So I can understand the need for that because if you're trying to create a new society, then maybe you don't want to have all those attachments that may bring forth the problems of the old society. Like for me, I can understand that. But the problem is that I don't think it actually does anything.
Right. I think that's true. It doesn't amount to much because I think the goal with this kind of invented language is to control the way people think. But really, it just controls the way people speak because when he goes to Urus, he understands very clearly what people mean when they refer to him as Dr. Shevek, even if he refuses the title. It's comprehensible to him, so he understands the intent, whether or not he chooses to speak that way. So it's more about a performance rather than a kind of a sincere difference in the way that they think.
Yeah, and you can definitely see it as we mentioned last week with the idea of my mother and mother. Like they very clearly have a family unit at the end of the book, and they very clearly know that Shevek is that girl's father. Even if she doesn't say, "You're my father, you're the father," the meaning is still there. And when she goes to him for solace, it's like any daughter going to any father for solace.
I think the second thing that's offered is kind of related to this is that they have an awareness of the internalization of power, or there is an awareness of the internalization of power in this novel. There's a scene where Shevik is talking to Vea, and Vea says, I know that you've got a Queen Tia inside of you, right inside that hairy head of yours, and she orders you around just like the old tyrant did her serfs. She says, do this, and you do, and don't, and you don't. Shevek responds, that is where she belongs, he said, smiling, inside my head. And then she responds, no, better to have her in a palace. Then you could rebel against her. It seems like what she is saying, even though she is meant to be an example of this kind of statist woman, is that she's saying it's better not to internalize power. It's better to have it as an external thing because when you have it in your mind, you don't recognize it as something distinct from you. You don't recognize it as something that you can confront. And that to me, I think, is quite significant. It's kind of like this idea from Foucault about, the difference between state power and discipline, where discipline is where you have embodied state power so much that it governs the way that you act and think from inside rather than something that's outside of you controlling you. That to me, I think it's important, but that's just one point in the novel. I don't think it's extended throughout.
I think that scene also kind of embodies a difference, not just in power, but in restraint. It's kind of like Shevek showing that he's got his id and his ego and superego all working together, whereas Vea is perfectly happy to let her id control her and rebel for the sake of rebelling. Like you said, it's not really borne out necessarily, especially since she proves to be just another cog in her world that isn't very different from anyone else on Urus. But that conversation makes it sound like she has very little restraint.
The final thing that Lewis brings up in the article, I think, is the most complicated. It's Shevek's research into the nature of time. Now, that when I was reading it was quite obscure to me. I didn't read it as carefully as perhaps I should. But did you understand that as being anarchist in any sense?
No, and in fact, I couldn't fully follow it as far as how the being and becoming were anarchist ways of thinking, how his sense of time was anarchist.
I think that it might not necessarily be anarchist, but I think it is perhaps more clearly postmodern. In another interesting article that I found, Physics as Metaphor, the General Temporal Theory and the Dispossessed, the author offers a very interesting way of thinking about this. And she says it's not a theory in the sense that it is trying to prove something new, but it is a theory that tries to show something about time that cannot be proven. So the author basically says that this theory of time that he offers is very similar to what in logic and mathematics is an important set of theorems, which are Gödel's incompleteness theorems. The idea, as I understand it, and I'm not a mathematician, but it's saying that in logic, there is no way to prove all of the things that we know are true about numbers. So there is something missing from logic in order to prove the truth of things that we know are true in mathematics. So there's a gap between truth and provability that I think Le Guin brings up in the novel as well. The author of the essay says that Shevek's insight into the nature of time is a similar kind of insight where proof is insufficient for truth. That, to me, I think is compelling because the idea that the other author, Lewis, makes is that basically Shevek is a scientist, but he's not a rationalist. He says a purely rational science could not produce his temporal theory. To achieve this theory, Shevek must give up a great deal. He must abandon a restrictive rationalism, and with it, the humanism that dominated the intellectual history of the West. I think that makes it clear to me how this could be understood as postmodern. But what I don't get is how does that extend anarchism? Isn't this just kind of like a postmodern idea in an anarchist novel? The only way I could rescue it is that you could say that the reason why Shevek is able to create this idea is because of his background on Anaris. And because of the way he was raised, he is able to think this way. But on the other hand, he did have to go to Urus in order to complete his work. So it seems to have very little to do with anarchism and very much to do with just the structure of the novel.
Yeah, it seemed to me like she was trying to show how both things work together. The same way that those two senses of time, the arrow and the circle, work together in order to make this Ansible function. Holding those two ideas of time side by side and, like Shevek, somehow able to have them coexist because you have to have them coexist. I saw it as just a mirror for her two worlds. It's not that one exists without the other, they both exist.
Do you mean that it's a way of representing Urus and Anaris as something that must exist simultaneously?
That's how I saw it. But I was also trying to force one sense of time onto one of the planets as some kind of symbolism. And I think she was kind of doing that, but she had it backwards from what I expected. So I don't know how much worth there is in pairing one with another in a one-to-one relationship anyway.
Well, if it's not anarchist, then what is the point of this part of the novel? Is it only significant that he makes some sort of scientific discovery, or does the actual content of what he discovers matter?
Well, isn't it more not that it's anarchist per se, but that it requires his understanding of both places in order to work, so that it's not just anarchist?
Let's say instead of time, he was studying something to do with fuel and propulsion. Would that difference matter?
I understood it as not the fact that he's studying time, but the fact that his study or his understanding of time led to the Ansible, which is what's important. Because the Ansible is the tool that allows people to communicate instantaneously and to garner some kind of understanding. That's what's important.
So then you would agree that time itself is not significant, like that being in the novel is not important to your reading.
I mean, it is important because the whole point of Ansible is that it's instantaneous. Like, that's the friction that we are talking about, earlier, how people might have different ways of understanding the same problem. When you have instantaneous understanding, you remove that friction.
I would not go that far because what the Ansible seems to offer is not instantaneous understanding, but instantaneous communication.
Yeah, I'm taking a shortcut here because I think one leads to the other, or at least for me in this book, it seems to intimate that. But yes, I mean, instantaneous communication as a way of bridging understanding between different people. All right, let's pause for a break. When we come back, we'll talk about Kim Stanley Robinson, our favorite writer. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So, yeah, what did you want to talk about in regards to Kim Stanley Robinson, Le Guin's contemporary and fellow NorCal resident?
So, Kim Stanley Robinson is a contemporary, as you said, also a leftist like Ursula Le Guin, but a different kind of leftist. And he remarked when he was giving a talk about her work that she was a different kind of leftist, but the difference between her anarchist sympathies and his Marxism didn't matter very much. He said basically, the front is broad, and to think too much about these differences is, he uses the phrase, the narcissism of small differences. So, if not now, when does the difference between Marxism and anarchism start to matter?
I was wondering if you think maybe it's because any change toward that sort of left, either one would be seen as extreme and radical here. Any change toward that sort of left is a plus to him, even if it's not his left.
I agree that's the way that he's thinking about it, but I'm more interested in how Sam thinks about it. Like, should we be content with just moving towards the left in any way, or should we be more specific and more thoughtful with the kind of political action that we want?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of with him in that I want more of a move toward the left. And there are probably things that I wouldn't want to happen, very, very radical things. But I know that those things aren't going to happen. So any move toward the left for me is beneficial. The extreme things that I can imagine happening are just imaginary things. And I,
Universal health care.
right. I mean, that's a good example of something that would be a move to the left, but not extreme, not, in my view, extreme. And most of the things I would like to happen wouldn't be very radical. It would just be a step or two. I feel like that's kind of the way he's looking at it as well.
So I didn't watch the video. What is Robinson's political belief? We know he's socialist, but is he communist? Is he like a hardcore Marxist?
He is a Marxist. In the video, it's only a couple minutes, but basically he says what I just said. The front is broad. I guess he's taking the front between right politics and left politics and focusing on the difference between Marxism and anarchism is a small difference that you'd have to be a narcissist to focus on.
Man, I have very vague recollections about the problems that either Marx had with Kropotkin or Kropotkin had with Marx. But I don't think they would agree with him.
Right. I think that the problem is basically it's too simplistic.
Well, I think part of the problem is that, once again, anarchism is really centered around force. It doesn't have to necessarily be leftist, but force and assent. That's what's important. So, can you have a Marxist society that is entirely voluntary? Like, I know people have proposed it, but I mean, if you're a real Marxist, I don't think you would.
Yeah, I think the problem with this is that he's viewing things just on one axis of right and left. It reminds me of those political compass surveys that libertarians invent to make you realize that, oh, you're actually a libertarian. Basically, when you start thinking about politics and you don't think of just right and left, you realize that there are so many significant differences. And for him to say that the difference between Marxism and anarchism is very small is ridiculous. And for me, as somebody on the left, I really think that this is an insufficient way of thinking about politics. And it's just really something that we have to abandon.
It does make sense in the context of American politics, though.
Right. That's kind of what I was going to say, that it's not that he's doing this within a vacuum. I don't want to put words in his mouth because I don't know exactly what he means either. But if he wanted his Marxism, he would go somewhere else entirely. You know, he's picturing living within the US.
All right, let's stop here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base here, you can let us know on Reddit. That link is below. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. If you'd like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That's also in the episode description. And if you liked this podcast, go ahead and give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with a wrap up on all three of the books in this series. We'll be talking about Paradise by Toni Morrison, Kirinyaga by Mike Resnick, and The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.